Well, thank you guys for coming to our wonderful series, Beyond Borders LATAM Clinical Intelligence webinar series. So, buenos dias, bienvenidos, welcome everyone. I am Sarah Toloski, CEO of Farmacon Global, and we're very excited that you're here. So really, thank you for joining us today. This webinar series is called Beyond Borders LATAM Clinical Intelligence, our ongoing series exploring the shifting landscape of clinical research in Latin America. Farmacon Global is a strategic partner to small and mid-sized biotechs providing high-touch clinical development, medical strategic consulting, and market access solutions with a specialized focus on emerging markets and diverse populations such as Latin America. So today, we're going to explore why Mexico in particular is the new frontier for clinical trials, focusing on one of the most exciting and fast-evolving markets in the region. And you may know that Mexico is one of the fastest growing healthcare markets. It's ranked 11th globally. It has a medical device sector worth about 30 billion and a pharmaceutical market with about 5 billion, and both projected to double within the next 10 years. So that's incredible. But you may or may not know that for many years, Mexico, as our neighbor to the United States, was viewed as the secondary player in global research, recognized for its patient diversity and strong investigator base, but held back by perceptions of complex regulations and slower timelines. And so that narrative has changed. Now, in the past 18 months, we've seen regulatory modernization, ethics committee efficiency, and a growing digital health ecosystem converging to position Mexico as really a very good strategic hub for both early and late phase trials. And so here at Farmacon Global, we see this evolution at firsthand. Across our network, sponsors are finding that Mexico offers the perfect balance: global quality data, accelerated approvals, and exceptional patient engagement, which is helping an increasingly harmonized with the FDA and EMA standards. So today, we're joined by three experts who represent that transformation from different perspectives, from regulatory, operational, and ethical, to unpack what's really happening. So here's who we have with us today, and then we'll get right into each question. After their comments, we'll have time for short Q&A, and we'll also make that recording available. So stay tuned. So the first one I want to introduce, Arturo Rodriguez Jacob. Raise your hand, Arturo. Arturo is the CEO and founder of Infinite Clinical Research, the oldest CRO in Mexico, with over 25 years of experience in research and more than 23 years supporting the pharmaceutical industry. As a biochemical engineer, he has a master's in business administration and also is the founding partner of ACROM and a respected academic speaker on clinical research topics. Julio Copo, raise your hand, show your face, Julio, is counsel at Arrochi and Linder, and they are also a major sponsor for this event. So we appreciate that, Julio. And he's out of Mexico City, probably down the street from Arturo, and brings over 15 years of experience in regulatory law, health and life and sciences, and compliance. With an advanced degree in administrative and international human rights law, Julio offers a unique perspective on Mexico's evolving regulatory landscape and its implications for global research. So thank you, Julio, for being here. And then we have our own dear Jenny Paredes, Dr. Jenny Paredes. Raise your hand, Jenny. Strategic Medical Associate at Farmacon Global. Brings over 25 years of experience in managing complex multinational clinical trials across Latin America. With a strong background in psychology and healthcare, Jenny has led operations and regulatory oversight in countries like, obviously, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and others. And today we'll share her valuable insights on clinical execution and quality excellence in Mexico's evolving landscape. So I'm going to ask some questions here of each of you. And then again, at the end, we'll be open for any other Q&A that you guys might have. So Arturo, if you want to unmute yourself, my question to you is, what recent regulatory updates in Mexico are making it easier and more efficient to conduct phase 1 through 4 clinical trials? And what should sponsors know about navigating these changes successfully?
Thank you, Sarah. The first, I want to say that the modernization of COFEPRIS goes hand to hand with the Mexican plan. The Mexican plan is a long-term national program of the President of the Republic for Development of Countries Regions. And one of these initiatives is in Plan Mexico is to increase the clinical research. Now we have around $200 million of dollars invest in clinical research, and is to increase in $2 billion by 2030. This is important change is that meet to goal to COFEPRIS is developing strategies to improve service and protocol authorization process. One of them is digitalization and using the single windows. On this, COFEPRIS has spent online submission on clinical trials, authorization, substantial modification, import permits, and specific payments using electronic files and electronic signatures that they permit to have more security and wildlife accepted now in the process to submit to COFEPRIS. This reduce in-person visits and submission times. That is a better option for the people that they develop the regulatory affairs. Another is publication of the checklist and the standardization forms. These forms permit them to standardize all the information that they can enter to COFEPRIS. They permit preventive to use information that is not necessary and make integrate checks more predictable. Is to say that now we can have exactly what is the information that COFEPRIS need in the case when you submit your package to obtain the protocol approval. Another is COFEPRIS has implemented an agreement that's a trusted regulatory practice, allowing for the recognizing protocols already approved by international agencies. That is the case of the EMA, the FDA, the MHRA, and the Health Canada. This permit that there are the equivalents to the agencies that they permit that all these dossiers that you submit in these other agencies can too has a faster approval in Mexico by this new politic. Another point that we are starting to have is the published review periods that in May they published that the times for the authorization of the protocols reduced the 90 to 45 days, but now is not complete this process according with the international politic. Is they need more time to standardize this time. But there has been reducing in starting to work exactly COFEPRIS in delay that they started to have with another studies that they have before this initiative. And COFEPRIS is working more in a COFEPRIS, if you remember, in 2001 was included in ECH, and now the COFEPRIS is starting to working with more guidelines that they permit to follow the ICH and GCPs in the section E6 and ECH in the section A, and accept that global dossier. That is the case of the DSURs for annual reports. That this is a good opportunity to reduce the times in this process. Referring the technical information, now an example of the brochure and the technical documents may remain in English, but all the information that is the labels or whatever other information that is the direction for the subject is mandatory that you need to present in Spanish. But this new use the two language in the submission permit the reduced cost and is more efficient to reduce even the times in the translation of the documents. Another is the National Pharmacovigilance Center that they are starting to implement the electronic channels for reporting the serious adverse events, the annual reports, the unexpected adverse reaction, and the SUSAR, they permit to submit the form immediately. This permits to increase the flexibility for the centralization of all this process, because you can use the remote and electronic process that they permit you use more efficient your time and more effective in the times that you need to cover with the authority. And other the changes that they started to do COFEPRIS is establish a program to site visit review or audits that they permit to guarantee that the protocol is conducting according with the specification and procedures, and to guarantee the safety information and the security for the subjects that is participant in the studies. Other is we have the human research that now is in actualization, that they permit under developed proposed. The idea is that they permit to modernize the clinical techniques in the clinical trials, that is the risk-based in monitoring or the electronic consent, the centralization procedures, and use the real-world data for the studies, because in the other process you need to have a specific data, or you can to use all the informed consent is in paper, and all this information is important. That now the digitalization is part of the evolution that the COFEPRIS is starting to do. According with the import and logistic efficacy, we are starting to have a standardization times for the import products that is to clinical trials. Is that now there are a differentiation, the normal importation to these materials, that now the 40 days, the standard time for products for clinical trials is 10 working days. This permits that they reduce, or they have more standard times in this process. Another other process is now in the custom office, is more common, principal in the airport of the Mexican City, or the principal points that enter this shipment for clinical trials. That is more common, that they have more familiar use with the research use only, that they permit that you don't have a specific or standard process. When they read the research use only, is because is material test directly for clinical trials. This is the points that that COFEPRIS is working. I think is a big effort that they are starting to do for modernize COFEPRIS. They need a big challenge that they need to complete, because in paper is many of these initiatives very well, but now is working to implement and standardization this process in the real life.
Great.
This is the modification that now starting to do.
Okay, super. Arturo, it sounds like there's a lot of changes happening, and I know from our experience it's taken time to kick in. So we're going to move on that subject to Jenny, because Jenny does have a hard stop. So we're going to miss you, or maybe first the questions, but it relates to what Arturo said, and that is, Jenny, how are Mexican ethics committees evolving to support this high quality clinical research, and what strategies can sponsors use to collaborate effectively on these phase 1 through 4 trials?
Thanks, Sarah. So, like Arturo just mentioned, quite a few improvements, right, that COFEPRIS has made this year. It actually started last year, but this year I think has been the year where we've had more changes. So what does that mean for ethics committees? Ethics committees now need to bridge the gap and reorganize themselves and their structure and their methodology of approval to meet COFEPRIS new structure, because we're not only talking about the digitalization of approvals. Now, committees also need to provide, specific unique forms, is what we're calling them, to actually meet COFEPRIS review process, right? So what do ethics committees now need? They need to adapt quickly, to what MOH is actually requesting from us, meaning committees, meaning research sites, meaning CROs, meaning sponsors. We all need to adapt quickly to what COFEPRIS is actually now requesting. Arturo actually made a good point. These new requirements came into play May of this year, which means we only have 6 months lead time. That's not enough time to actually trend the improvement throughout that time, right? But yes, ethics committees need to adapt quickly. They need to provide high quality information in those forms, which will allow COFEPRIS to review quicker and will actually allow us to meet those new timelines that COFEPRIS has indicated, right? from initial protocol, 90-day to 45. That's a challenging. We have seen approvals come in within that timeline, but we still do not have enough data to actually trend it. The other thing that ethics committees actually need to do is also keep up to date with the national government requirements, like all our different laws. Because when COFEPRIS changes their criteria, it hits us in the legal front, which I know Julio will probably speak about after me. The other also is ethics committees now have to become more professional, be better trained, in not only international procedures, GCP, ICH, but also everything that's ongoing here locally. And for sponsors, because I don't think we've spoken about that, it's also a good opportunity to start that communication early with ethics committees and sites early on, even before the submission phase, to allow us to move together as one unit, so that when it comes submission to the ethics committees and the regulatory agencies, then we're all better prepared, in case they issue requests for information or any of that. But for now, I do think that this year ethics committees have adapted quickly. We've had to adapt because it's moving very quick on the COFEPRIS front. I do think that next year we'll be in better position to trend the actual timelines that we have been able to fulfill, MOH requirements along the way. Submissions, approvals, requests for information, responses, import, which actually allows us to be better prepared to bring on more studies into the country.
Got it. So Jenny, since you have a hard stop, before we go to Julio and get the whole legal perspective, which I so appreciate, and he is a sponsor, so we appreciate that so much. How can our clients, our sponsors proactively engage with these committees to streamline these approvals? And you mentioned that the trending is coming, but is there any way we can enhance this process now, or are we just going to see that next year? What's your opinion?
I think there's really good things that sponsors can actually do. Like I just mentioned, start that communication early on. It's not just the communication with your assigned CRO. It's the communication with your ethics committees early on with the sites that are being selected. There has to be communication early on so that throughout the planning phase of the startup, then sponsors are able to get the information as clean and as, with good quality from the very get-go. The other is to build relationships. Sponsors don't actually build those relationships here locally. They always go through a local CRO, but it would be good to engage that, with maybe offering non-promotional trainings, from the sponsors to the different ethics committees and the sites on different therapeutic advances, on maybe, upfront GCP or European agency updates that are coming on, in their landscape where they're currently at, to be able to start communicating and facilitating that building relationship platform is very positive. And the other for sponsors is important to also know and reinforce the ethical culture here in Mexico. That piece is so important. It's not the same thing carrying out a study in the US or in Europe. When you speak to Mexico or Latin America sites, there's an ethical and cultural component. So understanding that piece is very important. And, just keep in contact with your ethics and your research sites and your CROs. We can't always just leave everything to the CRO that we hire here locally. We have to build those relationships. And that will actually also help with the MOH front. If we're attending congresses here locally, that actually helps us, people are aware that we actually exist from a sponsor's point of view.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's super. And I think your point about the cultural aspect needs to really be emphasized and the ethics are super high in Latin America. People maybe just don't know that. And so thank you, Jenny, for that information. And that takes us to Julio. So Julio, we appreciate you being here. And, we was talking about the law and all that. So we want to understand how our recent data privacy policies in Mexico impacting clinical research and what best practices should sponsors use to make that happen. That's so important.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very glad to be here. It's good to have this conversation with you all. I think what it's important to keep in mind is that we just had a change of our data privacy law in March 2025, which has a significant impact on clinical research. It's also important to note that the regulations for this law are still pending, even though they had 90 days to issue them. But we will talk about certain changes in government that I think are interesting to keep in mind from a data protection perspective. But the first thing I'd like to say is I think I would focus on this new law frames a shift in regulatory structure with increased emphasis pertaining to explicit consent, no? Explicit consent, as you know, health information, or as you may know, health information under our law is considered as sensitive information, as it is in other jurisdictions. So this means that the requirements for informed consent are heightened. You need to you need to have a very detailed privacy notice provided to the patient. The notice must clearly focus on the identity and address of who will be collecting the data, the site, the sponsor, what the specific purposes of the data processing will be, any distinctions between necessary and voluntary purposes. And our law also contemplates which we call ARCO rights, right? ARCO in Spanish means bow, but it's an acronym for access, rectification, cancellation, and opposition. So there are, of course, certain exemptions for clinical research and clinical trials, particularly pertaining to cancellation or opposition when it can compromise the trial's scientific integrity. But generally speaking, sponsors must have mechanisms in place to process any request from the patient pertaining to access, rectification, cancellation, and opposition of their data, no? Which I also think is interesting to talk about. There is an increased scrutiny on cross-border data transfer. As you probably know, clinical trials tend to be are inherently cross-border ever more now. So it's usually that we see that data needs to be transferred from the Mexican site to a global sponsor who will be the controller in any other jurisdiction around the world. So our data protection law requires that the data controller informs the patient and secures explicit consent for any data transfer to national or foreign third parties, particularly because health data, as I said, is sensitive personal data. And even though Mexico's law aligns with international standards like the OECD guidelines, the sponsor must still demonstrate that the receiving jurisdiction also provides an adequate level of protection, no? In terms of best practices, I think good strategies include data flow mapping and de-identification, making sure that every point of collection is well documented and is traceable from the Mexican side to the final database. And it's also very important that data is de-identified, pseudonymized, anonymized. I don't know what the correct term would be, but basically make sure that all data is anonymized to avoid the risk or minimize the risk of non-essential transfers. And a robust consent and privacy notice, as I was mentioning, complement this with standard contractual clauses, make sure that local institutions and CROs are or have in place a good agreement with whomever is sponsoring the trial, ensuring that there's a specific data protection officer or that there is someone equivalent within the local institution, and also be sure that you have standard operating procedures specifically pertaining to patient requests to access, rectify, or cancel their data. No, so I think this is sort of the way we're framing it now from the perspective of data protection. As I was mentioning in the beginning, as of this particular space in time, we do have certain uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty derived from an institutional shift where National Institute for Transparency and Access to Information, which was a former independent regulator, has been dissolved and the functions have been reassigned to a Ministry of Government, Anti-Corruption and Transparency Ministry of Government, which has created a certain period of institutional uncertainty. So our advice at this time is, even though we're navigating this uncertainty, sponsors have to be sure that they can anticipate potential new regulatory developments and have to be sure that all of these mechanisms are in place to avoid any potential risk in compliance responsibilities further down the road.
Well, that was a lot of great information, and it's exciting to at least hear that the data protection is really high in Mexico, as it is in all the countries in Latin America, but it sounds like things are changing as well, hopefully for the good. So I wanted to thank you, three speakers. I know Jenny had to drop off for a hard stop, and just open up the group here. Just go off mute and ask your questions if you have one. If not, we've got some sort of lined up. So go ahead. Who would like to ask a question? Any daring people here?
I'm happy to ask a question.
Go for it. Yes, thank you, Diana.
Yeah, no, thank you all. This is really helpful. I'm Jana Subramaniam. I'm the VP Head of Regulatory Affairs at Fund Bio. We're a small biotech company based out of the Boston area. And I mentioned to Samantha earlier that I have done trials in Mexico before, but we were reluctant to continue on because of all the restrictions and the timeline and the delay. So it's actually very encouraging to hear that timeline has been reduced, at least based on COFEPRIS new guidance. I think the only question, and it may be just because I don't remember it, Arturo, could you tell me, is in Mexico, do we do both the MOH and the EC submission together, or is it MOH first and then EC later? I couldn't remember. So, because I remember when Julie said the ethics committees have to come in line with the MOH, I didn't know where that disconnect was happening. That's why I was curious.
Yes, in Mexico it's sequential, the submission. The first is the ethical committees. When you obtain the approval, this information is submitted to MOH.
Got it. So if it's going to the ethics committee first, the total timeline has now been reduced to 45 days for both. Is that what you were getting at?
No, there are independent times. The committees starting to use. They have published the calendars that they have the evaluation of the protocols that they permit that you prepare your strategy. The when is the best time to submit to the committees and reduce the times, because more or less the evaluation of the ethical committees is the 4 to 6 weeks, depending the times that you submitted.
Okay.
Plus 40 days that the COFEPRIS is starting to publish, but now the real time is a little more.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
All right, great question. Thank you so much, Jana. And from Faris, he said there's a bit of background there. So his or her Faris, that's a female name, right? I think. So any updates or new regulation regarding compassionate use Maybe that's for you, Julio, and how data can be gathered from that assist in the clinical trials. I know that's been a bit of an issue. We talked about this earlier in rare diseases, that the compassionate use goes on for a long time because we're trying hard to get these products approved by the government. You have a comment on that, Julio?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's very relevant. I would like to start just by pointing out that what we refer to as compassionate use, uso compasivo, is much more focused towards treatment pathway rather than a research pathway. No, so there's unfortunately not a lot of development from the perspective of research at this time. However, I mean, it's something that we do see in clinical trials. It's I would say more as a best practice rather than something specifically required by law. Pertaining to data gathered, how can compassionate use data assist clinical trials? I would say it's not a substitute, no, but it does help in providing a real world evidence experience from patients. I think also compassionate use is also often involved with patients who have a higher risk or patients who are have comorbidities who would otherwise be excluded from other standard clinical trials. So I think this data from a high-risk group could provide interesting insights. I think it's still something, as I said, unfortunately, not a lot has developed from its original, the way it was originally framed, compassionate use in our general health law. It hasn't been updated. But we do see it more as part of clinical trials, simply as a decision from people who are carrying out, or from the sponsors of the studies, no?
Yeah, and I was just gonna kind of add to that, and maybe Arturo, you'd like to comment. I just want to say, like in our experience at Farmacon Global, it's a very good point you made, Julio, that to see the ripple effect on the system, and that's very true with rare conditions, rare patients, mostly kids that need a cardiologist, need a neurologist, need a physical therapist, and that kind of data would be very interesting to track, to get towards approval of, XYZ treatment, because that is a challenge. And like you said, it's more of a moral thing, it's not a legal thing. But most of the people that we've worked with do the compassionate use after the clinical trial for the purpose of the patient, for the good of the patient. Arturo, would you add anything to that comment?
No, only that Mexico started to do a very big effort to enter to the international clinical research global studies. Always in some presentation, I said that now we have the 1% of the participation of the clinical trials, the global clinical trials. If we move every year 1%, we increase $200 million per year, and we can obtain this goal that the government is starting to look. It is important that we working together, the authorities, the pharmaceutical, the CROs, the committees, the academic, in a big effort to promote the advantage, the use, the clinical trials in the health programs, because in the international or in the most advanced countries, that is USA or the Europe, is part of the objectives of the health authorities, the clinical trials, because they have the new opportunities for new patients. They don't have these possibilities to receive these therapies. And the most important is when we started to do clinical trials, we started to look to a better society, because it's with more health and more happy if you don't have more sickness.
Exactly, exactly. Well, great. I know we've gone a little bit over, so I wanted to just make sure. Yeah, go ahead, Jana.
Can
Go
I
ahead.
ask just one other question? Arturo,
Sure.
I'm actually curious, and again, it's been a while since I've done a Mexico submission. Could you remind me from a CMC perspective, is an IMPD sufficient, or is there some additional information that COFEPRIS now wants based on where things are for regulatory?
I think the collaboration with COFEPRIS to have more benefits is that they are more.
You went on mute.
I think
Sorry, bueno, the idea de COFEPRIS is that if there are many plans to embrace these possibilities to have more challenge in the protocol approvals, and now this plan permit that all these initiatives has more help to the community because they facilitate the information for registers and for the new drugs in the market. It's not was not clear to me if it is the question or you have an. I need to clarify.
No. It was more curiosity. That's all. Because I know the different Latin American, Brazil requires an IMPD now. Back in the old days, Brazil had other forms that they would use, but Brazil is one of the few countries that requires the IMPD. So I didn't know if Mexico also has that requirement or if it's much more lenient. That was just more curiosity for me.
Okay.
Great. And I mean, maybe it's a general question. How much, and it's for all three of you, how much of the information when you are wanting to conduct a clinical trial, can you use in English and how much must be translated? Because I know that's come up in many of our discussions with clients. Anybody can answer that question. Jenny or Arturo, Julio.
Yeah, so I think the documents that Arturo was mentioning earlier, protocol investigator brochure, those are the two documents that can technically be left in English, I believe. But everything else that is MOH required, because now we have standardized application forms called unique forms, all of that goes in Spanish.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of translation is what I hear. Go ahead, Julio.
I would also add that everything related to data protection and particularly everything pertaining to patients and everything related to participants in the trials will need to be translated into Spanish, and we'll also have to be locally mindful, no, particularly pertaining to specific patients, no. So that's in addition to what Jenny's pointing out. I think. Also from the perspective of data protection, it's also important to have things in Spanish.
And
Yes.
Julio, from a pediatric point of view, do you still have to get two witnesses or two guardians within the ICF? Get those both parents signed, and we got divorced parents, so that could be complicated, if I remember. Yeah? Okay, great. Great. Any other questions here in this group? Really been a very lively discussion. We appreciate it. And I know we went over, so I don't want to leave any stone unturned. No? Okay.
This was really helpful. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, again, we think we're not just catching up. Mexico's leapfrogging. We're seeing faster approvals for sponsors. It's more opportunities. And at Farmacon Global, we are partnering with all these partners here to leverage local expertise. So we really hope it sparked your interest. Feel free to reach out to us and stay tuned for our next Beyond Borders series. And we'll see you very much in the near future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.